As we continue our series that we're in for this Advent season, talking about theophanies, which is God appearing to a person in a physical, tangible way, not as a vision, which sometimes people have, of God in his throne room with Isaiah, for example, but God showing up in a way that has a personal appearance or appears as an individual. Here showing up to Joshua. See, when God is with us, it makes a big difference, right? When we know God is with us, and we know that, right? I mean, the promise of God being with us is there. But if we know it, if we have that reinforced by a tangible presence of the Lord, then it's going to make a difference in us and then in the surroundings, in the circumstances. Things change when God shows up. But God doesn't do that necessarily according to our understanding, our expectations, or our limitations. Here, having crossed the Jordan River, Joshua and the people of Israel were evaluating the enemy. See, Joshua was by Jericho, which is what we learn here in the beginning part of this reading at verse 13. Along with all of Israel, if we rewind a little bit into chapter 4, that's where the wilderness wandering has come to an end, right? And in chapter 4, it's where they cross the Jordan River, and it's a pretty exciting scene with the Ark of the Covenant entering the water. And if it's not a familiar story, look at Joshua chapter 4 for that, because it's similar to the whole crossing the sea with the coming out of Egypt, right? And in that scene, the water, was divided, and the whole people came across dry land, and then Pharaoh's army comes, and the water comes back. Here it happens kind of a second time, this time with the Jordan River. And in the description of it, the river is, flooding at harvest time or exceeding the banks. So it's not just a little creek or a narrow span, and the water stops flowing, the river. And it's miraculous what happens. So in Joshua chapter 5, beginning in the first verse, so backing up a bit from where we started with the reading tonight, all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over. When they heard that, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. So there's a huge number of people who have been wandering around, and word spreads, right? When there's the migrant caravan coming closer to the border, like between Texas and Mexico, we hear about it, right? That word gets to us. Now, they didn't have, instant communications and internet, and they couldn't, tweet about it. But they heard about it. They knew this was going on. They knew there was this massive group of people that was going from here to there, and they got to the river. The river's a pretty good defense. No bridge, no dam. God doesn't care, right? People need to get across, water dries up, they come across, water starts flowing again. That's in chapter 4. And then chapter 5, like we said, then they start with fear. Then this huge number of people come across. Then there's a bit of a pause in the action as circumcision happens for those who were born in the wilderness. So the people, while they were like Abraham, that gift was given to him, or that commitment, covenant of circumcision. We go back to Genesis, like chapter 17, which was immediately before our theophany last week. So circumcision happens, and then God shows up in the next chapter. Here, circumcision happens, and God shows up. It's not a pattern we see repeated, so we can't really build anything on that or expect that those two things necessarily go together. But it's an interesting thing to see between last week and this week that circumcision almost immediately precedes, at least in the way that the narrative describes it, this God showing up event. Then in chapter 5, verses 10 through 12, there's a celebration of Passover with a first time in Canaan. So there's these two major events have just happened circumcision, which is the covenant, right, between Israel and God, and that was, part of the requirement for them. And then the celebration of Passover, which is like the high feast of, Israel for being brought up out of Egypt, and a remembrance looking back at what God has done. Remembering how then God had led them through the wilderness in the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud and all the things God has done. And now they're facing Jericho, right? And Jericho was well protected. What's the first thing we think about when we hear the word Jericho? Walls. And it's reinforced by the song that maybe you sang in Sunday school or sometime. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho. We had a book when Max was little. Max is 23 now, and we still remember this. Like, we rock him to sleep. It was one of those that had the buttons on the side that played the really cheesy electronic sound of a tune. And so they were all like, Bible story and a little song that went with it. And so we'd flip to that page, and it was terrible. But he loved it. And so every night it was Jericho, Jericho. That was the song, and we needed we would play it, and we would sing it and remember the words to the song. And remember, the walls came tumbling down. Well, for walls to come tumbling down, you have to have walls. And so I found this from BibleStudyTools.com. And I actually saw a similar description in a couple places. And it says this: the mound or tell of Jericho was surrounded by a great earthen rampart or embankment with a stone retaining wall at its base. The retaining wall was some 12 to 15 feet high. On top of that was a mud brick wall, 6 feet thick and about 20 to 26 feet high. And there's a reference to a book written in 1973 about that. At the crest of the embankment was a similar mud brick wall whose base was roughly 46 feet above ground level outside the retaining wall. This is what loomed high above the Israelites as they marched around the city each day for 7 days. Humanly speaking, it was impossible for the Israelites to penetrate the impregnable bastion of Jericho. Within the upper wall was an area of approximately 6 acres, while the total area of the upper city and fortification system together was half again as large, or about 9 acres. So there you go. A well-fortified city. Not only that, there were supplies. They had a spring for water inside the city that's been discovered, archaeological, evidence of how the city had a water supply there inside the walls, so they didn't have to fetch water. They didn't have to have any kind of aqueduct or whatever. They had a water supply. And interpreting Joshua 3, verse 15, that describes the river at flood stage during harvest season, meaning that it was time for harvest, right? So there's a harvest that happens, so they bring all the food into the city. They've got water in the city. These people could hold out for a long time, right? They're secure in this walled city. And when we get to chapter 6, and we heard this read, now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in. So whatever kind of gate they had, whatever kind of system for letting people in and out of the city was, that's closed. We're sorry. We're under lockdown. There's this event happening, and we're just going to, for a few weeks, until this all goes past, right? Remember the words that were like that? And then it just doesn't go past. It's estimated that there were some few thousand people inside Jericho. Not a huge city. Sometimes I see pictures like artistic representations of it, and it looks like this massive place. Large walls, but it was they were capable of encircling the city in a day or multiple times when we get to that 7th day. So this is all possible. So they're well supplied. So Israel needs to understand what Jericho's doing. Jericho's looking out at what Israel's doing, right? They're evaluating the enemy. And then there's the other guy, right? There's the other guy. Understanding the unknown has to happen. The unknown can be hard to face. We faced the unknown before. When we're up against something that we don't understand, there's questions. doubts and fears can creep in easily. It's unknown enough what's behind those walls, right? What's going to happen if and when, because we're coming across the Jordan and we're supposed to take this city, and word probably spreads that this is the idea, right? And then they look, and there's this massive, high walled place. And you got to be thinking, okay, if we get above that first wall and then, over it, now we're down in this no man's land kind of area, and that second wall inside the first, they're going to be up there with bows and arrows or whatever they've got, chucking rocks at us. Who knows what they're going to do? And we're just out in the open at that point. But then there's the other guy. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. A man with a drawn sword. He's ready to fight. This is not just, armored with the sword tucked away, prepared, but, drawn in his hand. There it is. And Joshua, this is the miraculous, surprising part of it, goes up and asks him, whose side are you on, buddy? Is that, do you approach a guy with the sword? I'm not sure I would. But with some boldness, Joshua went to him and said, are you for us or for our adversaries? There's no physical description, really. It's just a man with this weapon. But who's he there for? And Joshua learns that the Lord has come. The commander of the Lord's army was present. It's an interesting answer to Joshua's question. Are you for us or for our adversaries? And the answer, no. Sometimes we do that with questions that we hear from our kids. Is it this or that? Yes. Maybe you've gotten that answer before. Can I go this way or that way? Yes, you could go either way. It's fine. But instead of yes, it's no. No, I'm not for you or for your adversaries. Now I have come. And I think the interesting thing about that is it's just an announcement of presence. See, it's not I'm for them, and we know that this is, the commander of the Lord's army. So it's not going to be for the people of Jericho. This man, right, is going to be for the people of Israel, but ultimately, his presence is what's making the difference. He's not there to aid them. See, he's there. He was there. God with us makes all the difference. So Joshua responded to the Lord's presence. He fell down and worshiped. And there's some parallels between what he does and if we go back to Exodus chapter 3, Moses in the burning bush, right? There's some worship. There's the presence of God in a mysterious kind of way, or interesting kind of way. And then there's the take your sandals off holy ground words. So this is it's not a man, right? I mean, it becomes pretty obvious that this is not just a man with a sword. There's more to it than meets the eye initially. So Joshua fell down and worshiped, and then he submitted to the Lord's authority and direction. So whose battle is it, really? Proverbs chapter 21 says this, "The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord." See, God is fighting for us. What Joshua is understanding or maybe processing or even remembering is a promise through the mouth of Moses. Rewinding to Deuteronomy chapter 3 at verse 21. So will the Lord do to all the kingdoms into which you are crossing. So Deuteronomy, Moses is preparing the people. You're going to go into the land. You're going to cross over the river. You're going to go into where this land that was promised to Abraham, we're taking it back, and this is what's going to happen. You're going to cross in there, and it's going to be good. See, this is what God's going to do. This is what the Lord's going to do to these kingdoms. You shall not fear them, for it is the Lord your God who fights for you. The Lord your God who fights for you. Are you with us or are you with our adversaries? They begin to understand. The battle belongs to the Lord. The Lord is fighting for us. God fights battles that we see, that we understand, but we know this, right? That God's fighting for us in ways that maybe sometimes we don't even know. God's doing things that we don't always recognize or we don't always see. And through that, God brings victory. God brings victory. Just understanding what happens there at Jericho, we know this, it's according to his plans. The instructions for Joshua and for Israel are this: march around the city once a day for 6 days. And then on that seventh day, march around it 7 times. Okay. That's a plan. Or, just hear me out on this, we could, think about some battering ram kind of thing, right? I mean, we've seen this before. We were in Egypt. Those people knew how to do stuff, right? We could build one of those ramp things that would go up to the wall. We could build that. That's something that we could do. No march? We're supposed to just march? Okay. Right. As a military strategy, marching around the city quietly, right? I mean, they have horns, but there's no horns, there's no shouting until the last time. So once a day, march around, go back to camp. And the people inside are probably like, what are they looking for? What are they doing? They just went and camped again. Okay. All right, put the bows down, boys. We're okay for tonight, right? I don't know. Or a sneak attack, or let's wait till they're, trying to get people out or people in, or let's get some people in there. Spies had gone in, and Rahab had protected them. That's also earlier in the book of Joshua. So they know what's inside the city. They've got an idea, but here's the battle plan: march around the city. God's plans don't always make sense to us. Then you see in our gospel reading, disciples with Jesus in the garden. This is the night he's being betrayed, and the moment that it happens. And we know from a different gospel that it's Peter that pulls out the sword. This one doesn't name him, call him out for it, right? But Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Sometimes God's plans mean put the sword away. Do things that don't make sense to how we would plan, how we would strategize, and go along with what God has in mind. Do the things that God has in mind to do. Because God's battle plan doesn't always look like victory, right? Because what happens with Jericho, they're walking around, and then the walls fall down in a way that doesn't make sense. What happens with Jesus? He's taken away and crucified in a way that doesn't make sense at all. And the victory that's won is won through the death of Jesus. Sometimes we look at difficult circumstances, we don't see a way to win. Or, like Peter, we want to take action, right? We want to attack the problem on our own strength, on our own power. But we remember that God brings victory according to his plans and in his timing. I can imagine people going along with that, walk around the city, and go back to camp. 1 day, 2 days. By the 3rd day, I'd be like, we did this already. Just once today? Seriously? Are we going to see something different? Are we going to do something? No, just walk. Okay. 4, 5 days? Well, we wandered for 40 years. I guess we can do this loop. And then that 7th day, the first time around, second time around, same deal. Like, okay, we're the 3rd time around. Let's blow the horn. Let's get this done. But it's God's timing, and there's no shortcuts to that victory. We can't bypass and, jump to the front of it We can't get there on our own timing. It's God's timing, and it happens by faith. See, God brings victory by faith. In the great faith chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, which is like the Hall of Fame of, it was by faith that Abraham did what he did. It was by faith that this happened. It was by faith that happened. And at verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. See, how did that victory come? By faith. By the faith and obedience of the people of Israel doing what they were told to do. The commander of the army here, the man, the sword in his hand, ready to go. But it's not charging in a battle. It's not leading the people. Let's go tear it down brick by brick. Let's go according to this plan. Walk, trust, obey, believe. That's what it looks like. God's with us, fighting for us, and asking for us to believe, to trust, to submit, to obey. Through that, he brings victory. Through ways that don't make sense, through things that don't look, according to our eyes, like the best way, the fastest way, or even a way that would work. But he brings victory. To him be glory, now and forever. Amen.